Okay, so I want to talk about, if you like, the roles of haiku in Haibun, and of the many reviews that have been done of Haibun, a writer's guide, which, by the way, we call Hawg, Hawg. One of them, which was in Contemporary Haibun Online, actually complained because we spent too much time on haiku and not enough on prose. And the reason for that is that we believe, all three of us, that the right haiku is absolutely essential in a haibun, and that's why we spent so much time on it. And in this presentation, I don't want to talk about braided or embedded haiku in haibun. I don't want to talk about multiple haiku in haibun. I just want to keep it simple. I want to talk about a piece of prose and how that haiku relates to the prose, how it links and shifts, and the degree of shift that makes a perfect, if you like, spark. So this is the late and great Ken Jones, fantastic haibun poet. He says that haiku powers up the prose, and that's the distinctive, unique power of haibun as a literary genre. And this is my belief. I think a haibun is only as good as its haiku. I believe the haiku should be strong enough to stand alone without the prose. You should be willing to send that haiku off standalone to Frog Pond or Modern Haiku or The Heron's Nest with confidence. The haibun that fail, in my experience, and also Rich Humans and Roberta's, are haiku that purely duplicate the prose because they bore the reader to death. Like, I've already read that in the prose. Or they leap too far and they lose the reader. Okay. So just a bit of a warning on what follows. Please don't treat what I'm saying now as formulaic. You can't beat a haiku surfacing as a result of the natural emergence process. But what I'm going to tell you now comes from trying to understand why some haibun don't work, both from my own work and also as an editor. And I spent a lot of time thinking about those. And most of the time, it's because there's no spark between the haiku and the prose. And the best way I can describe it is the haibun just doesn't fire, falls flat. So I just want to talk about two very simple haibun forms. The first is where you, and by the way, there's obviously a title above each of these. The first is where you have a block of prose and the haiku follows. And probably in a more rare case is where the haiku precedes the prose. And they act very differently. So on the one on the left, where the prose is followed by a haiku, the haiku actually provides new insights. It adds to the prose. It can provide clarity, it can deepen the prose, or it could be a true revelation. But in the first one, it's a softer effect. The haiku actually provides an introduction, a foundation, and the prose follows. We'll see later on that in that second case, the one on the right, it works best where there's a big hard landing at the end of the prose, like a big epiphany at the end of the prose. And so the haiku is not following that prose because it would take away the power of that big ending of the prose. But we'll come to it later. So yeah, this is Hawg, and we examine the roles of haiku based on the placement and the degree of shift from the prose. And those of you who've read Hawg might have seen this little plot. Okay, I own up to this. I did this bit. And what we did was we took a piece of prose, which you can see on the left, and we played around with where the haiku would fit in relation to that. And so the prose was very simply flat and barren here, the barn caved in, the silo rolled away. Only yesterday the roof blew off the house, little to stop the wind except this faded building once a schoolhouse. Lovely piece of prose. And we, in the top left-hand box, I'll use my arrow, we played around with a haiku which precedes it, and then three which follow it. The one that precedes it is a scene setter. I'll come back to these. And the ones that follow is, in this case, it clarifies the prose. In this case, it deepens the prose. And in this case, it's a big leap and it opens up a new narrative. So let's just have a quick look at these. So this is the prose poem. It's by a poet called Jim Johnson. Lovely piece of prose. And we're going to try and generate 4 different haiku for it. So the first one is we want a haiku that precedes it. And this is the one that I came up with. The small world of prairie dogs, big sky. And then it leads into the prose. So what is this introductory poem doing? Well, it's basically setting the stage. Okay, we're in a prairie. But it's doing more than that. It's contrasting small and big, small world, big sky. And that's reflected in that prose. So you've got the little schoolhouse sitting there in a flat and barren plain. So it's a very nice introductory haiku for that prose. Now, by contrast, you could say, well, why don't I put a haiku after that prose, but one that just clarifies or concludes the prose, like this. Dust Bowl tour, all the children on their phones. Now, straight away, we realize that prose is actually written by someone who's on a tour. And there's children around, which reflects back to that schoolhouse of the past. And boy, oh boy, they're on their phones. What a commentary on today. So that's, if you like, concluding or clarifying the prose. But what if we wanted to deepen the prose, say more than you can read in that bit of prose? Then you can come out with something like this. Where it began, stripped birch switches in the cane rack. So now we're looking at a cane rack in this old schoolhouse, and we're imagining what those canes were used for. Stripped is intentionally put in here because those of you like me who've been caned would recognize that word. And so it links back, it deepens the prose, it adds to it. There's a historical context being brought forward. But what if we wanted to have a big leap away from that prose? Well, here's an example. 20th reunion, the classroom bully looks like dad. And you go, wow, where the heck did that come from? That's a heck of a leap. Why did it look like dad? I mean, anyway, it opens up a lot of new narratives. So you can see the degrees of shift away from that prose. You get different effects. So change of axis now. There's the prose, and on the left-hand side is a haiku that's preceding it. And we'll look at haiku that basically will relate to that prose. If one just repeats what's in that prose, it's boring, so you dump that. One that clarifies or concludes the prose, maybe a slight shift away from prose, but if you like, it adds to it. One that moves further away from the prose, that amplifies or deepens it. If it jumps a long way away, it opens new narratives and insights. Interestingly, a lot of Haibun poets strive for that. They think that big shift is, creates a great big effect. And I would argue that some of the more subtle shifts are often more powerful. And then a really big leap, oh, it's too far, you've lost the reader. The reader can't see the link between that haiku and the prose anymore. So that's a very simple model of how you can have a haiku preceding, you can have one that deepens or clarifies and extends, that leaps away, but don't leap too far and don't repeat what's in the prose. And there's these 4 examples I gave before. The one, small world of prairie dogs, big sky preceding, and the other 2 followed by the big leap with the bully that looks like dad. So it's a pretty simple model. And that's what we put in Haibun, a Writer's Guide, and we try to explain that degree of shift that you could have and the sparks that are released by it. So, you can conclude and say that haiku are essential to Haibun. It's the nuts and bolts, and people want to have the big shifts, but the softer shifts are sometimes more powerful. The interesting thing is that any epiphany that occurs in that haiku, the larger the shift, it shifts towards that haiku. So let me explain what I'm saying. in this particular case, by definition, a big shift, the epiphany is in the haiku. Here, the epiphany could be in the prose, and all that's happening is that haiku is deepening it. But a big shift, the epiphany is actually in the haiku. So the key thing is, the bigger the shift, you better make sure that haiku can live up to it. All right. So is that it? Well, that was it in Haibun, a Writer's Guide. But I want to just deepen that a bit and just talk about something that you could actually workshop for yourself. What happens if the prose ends in a hard landing, that there's a big epiphany at the end of the prose? So I want to give you a little example. So Roberta and myself, we had a linked Haibun in Rattle earlier this year, where each of us wrote, if you like, a Haibun in response to the other's Haibun. And this is just one of my little pieces of prose. 6 years it was, sleeping on couches, waiting for mam to get better. Every aunt took a turn. That links back to what I was saying before, where I stayed with different aunts for quite some periods of time. So if you were to take that little bit of prose, you could do an introductory haiku. But actually, there's no big hard landing epiphany in that prose. So really, you want to have a haiku that follows it. And what would you do? Well, you could do a big shift away, both in time and space, or you could pick up one of those things about an aunt and you could write a haiku about it. The key thing is that that's not what I wrote. What I actually wrote was that. 6 years it was, sleeping on couches, waiting for mam to get better. Every aunt took a turn and every uncle. Now that's a very different kind of piece of prose. And that final sentence there, that's a hard landing if you think about it. So if you take that piece of prose, it leads you more towards doing an introductory scene set in haiku. If you put a haiku after that kind of prose, don't compete with that hard landing. Deepen it if you like, but don't try and do a big shift away from it, because you've already got the big punch there at the end of the prose. Okay. So in that particular case, yeah, dump the one on the right, clearly, dump this one. But this one, this big shift away doesn't work. You're taking the power away from that prose. So I'm going to give you some examples of these, and I'm just going to open up a different file if I can get to it. And these are the ones that I said I would do based on some of them from Ira. So these are examples picking up how these haiku relate to the prose. I'm using portrait now because Haibun actually are better presented in portrait rather than landscape. And I've already tested that these are readable. If you can't read them, don't worry, because I'm going to read them aloud. So having said that, you can't see the title. This is called The Needle's Edge. Here's a haiku that starts off, and it's set in the scene. Stroking a leaf of lamb's ear, Cub Scout forage. This didn't appear in Ira. It appeared last year in Modern Haiku. Now that kind of haiku is scene setting. Okay, so we know Lew is in the Cub Scouts and he's out on a trip and he's got a piece of lamb's ear, which is a plant, and he's stroking it. Okay, I understand where we are. Then you get this piece of prose. There's a crack in the ceiling. Someone has tried to seal it during the last week, but there's still a gap. I can feel the air being sucked out of the room. Maybe if I can make myself that small. So again, in your own time, what else do you remember of that day? Oh, wow, that's a shift. Now we're on a couch. We're with a therapist. So you can see what's happening here. You've got a scene set in haiku, but it's not really a scene setter. It's actually talking about something in the past, which allows you to then do this final haiku, which deepens that prose. Deep in the gorge, specks of lint on his stubble. And I would say that the word gorge was intentionally chosen there. So this is the use of haiku to change, to have temporal shifts, and if you like, almost confuse and shock the reader. So the first haiku is in the past, the second is in the present with a therapist, and the third is going back to the past. And that's what you're either saying or not saying to the therapist. This is one called Class Act. This appeared in IRA, so you know it's true. Okay, this is true. This is an engagement party. We didn't stay engaged for long, I'm afraid. Class Act. Little bit of an explanation. So in Splot, where I'm from, we didn't have dinner parties. So the first time I had to go to a dinner party, a posh one like this, I went to see my friend, and he told me that when you're in a dinner party, don't worry about it. You'll have lots of knives and forks. Just work from the outside in. Take the outside knife and the outside fork and gradually work your way in. All right. So just work your way from the outside in, my best friend Toby said, and I have. But this is where I am, eating lemon sorbet with a steak knife and fork. The problem, as I now see it, is that I passed on the third course. I think they called them artichokes. It's been one pair of cutlery behind ever since. Still, things seem to be going well. Her bejeweled mother, in recognition of our engagement, has just called me a rough diamond. Now, there's lots of ways that you can follow a piece of prose like that. You could do a big shift, but I chose to actually, if you like, deepen it and continue the prose. Stiff upper lip, or aunt's best wishes under the table. So this is an example of continuing the prose with the haiku. This is one that occurred in modern haiku. This isn't in IRA, but clocking out from the crab factory, and me, cocksure, waiting at the gates. She cracks a tired smile, slides one chapped hand into mine. The other holds a weighted plastic bag. She is much older and intoxicating. Her hair smells of the ocean. 2 minutes later, we're on the harbor seawall, our legs dangling over granite. Scallops too small to make the cut laid out between us. She opens one, touches its muscular foot with her knife, watches it react and withdraw. That's what they all do, she says, before biting into the meat. So I submitted this one to Roberta at Modern Haiku, and she came back and said, I've got to have this because I love that final sentence in the prose, but I hate the haiku. And in fact, the haiku is pretty bad. And so I played around with it and tried various things and ended up with a temporal shift. And if you're going to write Haibun and you want to have a shift away from something with a big hard landing at the end of it, because that last sentence is a pretty powerful piece of like, wow. Changing the time in which the haiku is occurring often works. This prose is in the past. This haiku is in the present. Find in the grave by her given name, wild flowers. So this was set in the Orkney Islands, and this is going back to the Orkney Islands, trying to find her grave. Of course, she's much older than me, and she's dead. And the only thing I have is her given name. So that's a deepening of the prose with a temporal shift. Here's one from Ira. I had lots of aunts, and invariably they weren't very nice people. So this is entitled Matriarchs. The closer one came to my mother's side of the family, the more refined the insults. My father's sisters had no problem with the simple word ugly, though they could embellish at times. Looks like she's been hit by a bus was a favorite. Of course, my maternal grandmother usually hid behind her Welsh, whispering hush at facial hair and bald babies, or achavi at cold sores and bad feet. And so it was a relief to hear her simply call me plain one day. As for ma'am, she had the same word for every girlfriend I brought home. Unfortunate, she'd sigh, followed by a sniff. So I think it took me a few weeks to get the right haiku to go with this. And I played around with, went up a number of dark alleys. But what I wanted to convey is that these were women that should never be saying that because people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. So they were making these terrible comments about people. They should have looked at themselves, to be honest. And so I came up with this one. Christmas afternoon, chasing down smoke rings from the hole in Gran's throat. So that's a deepening of the prose. And my Gran had a tracheotomy because of heavy smoking, and she still smoked, would blow smoke rings through it. This is a fossil fish from the Devonian, 390 million years old. It's called an Osteolepis. This one, you can't see the title at the top, I don't think, because of the bar at the top. This is deposition, which, as you probably appreciate, has got a double meaning. The process of depositing something, and also deposition in the case of a legal comment statement. So I have a PhD in geology, and this was when I was doing field work with a friend of mine in the Orkney Islands. Help yourself, the quarryman says. Steve saunters over to the dark layer, then motions for me to come. This is indeed what we've been looking for, the Sandwich fish bed of Devonian age. The rock splits easily, and we find fragments of the armored fish, Cocosteus, and an occasional fin. We note sheen preserved on many split surfaces. This is primary current lineation caused by the alignment of tiny mica flakes as water sloshed across the ancient lake bed. The sheen marks the orientation of the paleo current, but not its direction. Suddenly I hear a yell. Steve has found something. There in the middle of a large mica sheen surface lies a complete Osteolepis. The fossil fish appears perfect, though one scale is missing. 9 inches away along the primary current lineation, we find it. So this was quite an important Haibun for me, because the haiku that resulted from this literally flew onto the page, and I had no idea it was coming. And by the time it went onto the page, it was too late to take it away. And you'll see what I mean. It's a really big shift. Where she was found, my mother's head pointing against the tide. So this is what I mentioned before about the gradual surfacing of my mother's death, and then, if you like, this is the real thing now, with a big shift. This is I want to talk about using haiku in a slightly different way. I had the idea of having a concrete haibun, which was like a telescope looking back through time. And this is called Far, Far Away. So this is depicting, once for the reader anyway, I wanted to create the impression that this was a telescope. And so I had this in my mind that I would do this, and I would have the text, and the text would gradually change as it went through time. I came out with this haiku first, which is unusual for me. A long time ago, the light from Betelgeuse, rose tinted. And this was a haiku that helped enormously create that storyline of how what you think of in the past today is not really what happened in the past. It helped me to write about a painful thing in the past without being explicit about that. And you're going to say, well, how did that work? So I'm going to show you how it worked. So take this haiku. There's the haiku at the bottom. And here's the text, where the outer text there is what I remember now. but actually what really happened was the inner text. And I'll read them out for you. The outer one. And he was always there for me and me alone, forever and ever and ever. That's very rose tinted, isn't it? Let's go one level in. And he was always hunting down the bullies, then patting me on the shoulder. Still rose tinted. Go in another layer. And he was always hunting the birds on his belt, his arm around my shoulder. And then we get to the truth. And he was always hunting me down, loosening his belt as he threw me over his shoulder. Now you're going to say, well, how did I get that from that haiku? So I want to pick up three words: hunting, I want to pick up shoulder, and I want to pick up belt. Betelgeuse is in Orion. It's the pink star that's in Orion, and you identify Orion by Orion's belt. Orion, another word for Orion is the hunter. And then the third thing with Betelgeuse is it comes from the Arabic word big shoulders. So in that story, there's the hunter or hunting, there's the belt, and you get the gist. So I've used that haiku to construct a storyline that's authentic about something that happened to me in my past, but is too painful to basically be explicit and truthful. I'll show you one that, not because of the haiku, but I'll tell you why I'm showing you this. This is one that occurred in contemporary, McQueen's Quintily. Sorry, Claire. I'm not going to read it, but basically it's a haiku, a haibun, where the prose is the instruction manual on how to construct an IKEA bookcase. And I can tell you, I can never, ever construct anything with IKEA, and they always end up this shape. So here, like in many concrete haibun, the concreteness, if you like, is within the prose. So the question is, can you imagine ever doing a concrete haibun where the concretization is actually in the haiku? And I've got one coming out in Rattle later this year. So if you keep an eye out for that, I can't recall ever seeing a haibun where the concretization is actually created by the haiku. So just to finish, if you want to play around with some of these ideas, the simple thing is just create a block of prose. Make it simple, put it in the present tense, do it third person or first person, and just create a simple block of prose. And then start playing around with haiku that like precede the prose. Or you can write ones that follow the prose and just play around with different degrees of shift. Which ones work better where? Then you can basically experiment with soft versus arresting haiku. Which works best preceding the prose? Which works better, if you like, when it's following the prose? So you get a nice link and shift, and if you like, a spark created between the haiku and the prose. And then play with different endings of the prose, like that one I showed you before, where I added my uncles. Have a simple bit of prose and then introduce a shock at the end. How does that affect the kind of haiku that you want to follow that, or even precede it? Which one works best? So we don't have time to workshop today. If we had done, I would have done this. Anne Sullivan is on the call, and Anne and I have actually done this work in some mentoring work that we've had, and I think she'd attest to the fact that it works pretty good. So I'm just going to come out of my screen share. I'm back. And so that's my presentation on the roles of haiku in Haibun.
Very good. That was really great. Thank you. Even I understood it, so that must mean something. So you all can unmute yourselves. And here's your chance to ask Lew questions if you have questions about his presentation.
Yeah, I'm more familiar with the haiku at the end than at the beginning. But I've also read Haibun that has haiku interspersed between the prose. Do you have thoughts about that, Lew?
Yeah, well, there's two ways well, many ways, but the two main ways that's done is one where you take, let's say, the 3 lines of a 3-line haiku, and you split the lines and thread them through, and that's called a braided haibun. And we spend some time in this talking about those. And the third is where you have multiple haiku occurring within. When Rich and I and Roberta talked about this, one of the things we talked about is how do you know how many haiku to put in there? And where do you put them? And I think it's rather like you get a feel for it. So when you write in prose, I don't know whether I've got a lot of echo coming through here. When you write in prose, if you're writing a short story, for instance, you the gut feel where the paragraph ends occur. And I tend to do the same thing with my haiku. If prose is going too long, like don't write a whole page of prose and then tag a haiku on the end, because the reader is usually fallen asleep by the time you get to the haiku. So I probably would split the prose and put a haiku in the middle there. I think the most I've ever had in a haibun is five haiku. Okay, hope that helps.
First of all, thank you very much. That was very educational. And this is Faye. And as you may know, I'm not the good Haibun lover. I only wrote maybe a handful Haibun in my life because I thought you can say a lot of things in the haiku, so I don't need it Haibun or things like that. But your explanation and your approach was quite interesting. I may not become a Haibun lover, but still, it's just very, very interesting.
Well, thanks,
That's
Faye.
what I just want to say it.
Thanks, Faye. As long as you love me, that's all right. That works. That's great.
Lew, I'll just say that this presentation was just brilliant. And I tend to be a very intuitive reader, Haibun writer, and a judge. But to hear you speak about it and to have you show the examples, it's just brilliant and extremely helpful, I know, for all of us that write Haibun, and probably for those that only write haiku as well. So thank you for sharing this. And I also want to ask you, are you selling copies of Ira, or do we need to get it from across the pond?
So I don't. I'm going to make a little announcement now. I don't know whether I'm supposed to do that. We ran out.
Oh, darn.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think John was pretty surprised about it as well. So we've gone into a second printing, and he's just received the second prints. I haven't actually. So no, you just write to. You'll get a response from John pretty quickly. Just write to Snapshot. And
Okay.
Anyway, we're very, very. I'm extremely proud of this. Yeah, especially for a Haibun book, I think he was pretty surprised. So
Great, thank you.
There are links to both of Lew's books in the chat.
Oh, thanks, Tanya.
Lew, would you mention to people about the cover of the book?
This.
Yes.
Yeah, we were looking for. So once we landed on the title as being Ira, and by the way, it couldn't be anything else really, and that it's a Welsh word for snow. We were thinking about a title, and I mean, because I'm not artistic, I had the idea of snow-covered fields and whatever. And John said, "Well, no, we need to have something with a snowflake." And so he said, I've seen some Japanese muslin somewhere and I'm going to search. So God bless him. He ordered, no, it's Chinese. He ordered it from China and got this beautiful fabric. This was in about end November. And then he went silent because he's supposed to be taking a photo of this and sending it through to me. And so I'm waiting and waiting and waiting. And it got to about March and I pinged him and I said, John, where's the cover? And he said, Lew, it hasn't been the right light outside. We've just had a dull winter here and the light hasn't been right. But I think we're going to have a sunny day this weekend. And so I'm going to take the muslin out and take the photo. Right. So he did. And one of the things that was brilliant about it was, I don't know if I can see this. He even managed to highlight this one little snowflake here. The other thing is the way it's wrapped around, it looks as though it's wrapped around someone's neck. And that neck is the person is missing now. And that person that's missing is my mother. And as soon as I saw it, I said, that's just genius, you know. So I'd love to take credit for it, Patricia, but this was John Barlow. I mean, you know.
Well, and I want to ask John, are those snowflakes real?
No, they're embroidered into the
Oh,
muslin.
they're embroidered. Okay, I can't see the
Yeah.
texture.
Wait,
I got it.
yeah.
Classic Barlow.
I wish he was on the call to listen to all this. He probably thinks I'm going to be, you know, bad mouthing him. So if you see him, tell him I've said really nice things about him.
He can see the recorded ones.
And Michael, you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you for this presentation, Lew. I appreciate the deep thoughtfulness of your presentation, for one thing, but also deep thoughtfulness that goes into your writing. And I would encourage more people to think as thoughtfully about the options that they have at their disposal and just to be more aware and more intentional and conscious of what's done, balanced with spontaneity too, of course. But yeah, less dashing off and more thoughtfulness, I think, is a good thing in haiku and haibun, and you're the poster child for that, so thank you.
Oh, thanks, Michael. That's very nice of you. Yeah, I mean, I think I was talking to people in the breakout sessions. So the three of us, when we wrote, I know I'm flipping between books here, but so this one, when we started writing it, I think we didn't expect to agree on virtually everything. There were only two areas where we disagreed, and we've highlighted that in the book, and they're tiny. But the one thing that we really agreed with is that when you start talking about concrete, Haibun, if you basically use concrete, and I think people know what I mean by concrete, it's not a gimmick. You know, I mean, don't just put a shape in there because the shape looks pretty, or you know, change the font and this, that, and the other. It's got to serve the purpose. It's got to really support what you're trying to do. And we were all of us were keen on that. Roberta doesn't do so much concrete, although she's done some very interesting innovative pieces. Like I remember one was a shopping list, which was pretty incredible. Rich has done one. I'm just thinking, yeah, it's just come out in the latest issue of Frog Pond, and I was on duty as editor, and he submitted it, and I just thought, oh man, I've got to have that. That's a beautiful piece where the structure supports the text, if you like, the subject matter.
I would echo what Michael just said about how thoughtful your presentation was, Lew. It really is inspiring to see one layer and then you go another layer deeper and another layer deeper. And I think I read somewhere somebody said, it's not a good idea if your conclusion is where you stop thinking. That you need to take it to the conclusion rather than to where you just got kind of tired of doing it. So I appreciate how you don't stop at the first or the second layer, but go to the core. Thank you.
Actually, one thing I would say is that, you know, I said about where the concreteness or the innovation is in the haiku. So I'll give you a little bit of a hint. You know, if you've like, if you're selling a lawnmower in the local shop, you'll have for sale, and underneath you get these strips, and you can tear off a strip and it's got a telephone number and you can phone in. I can't remember what they're called now. Or if you've got a lost cat, there's a picture of your cat, and then there are these strips down and you tear one off, it's got a phone number. Well, I've done a Haibun that's that shape. And the strips are the individual words of the haiku. So I hope it works. So if you see it, let me know if you ever read it on Rattle, if it works for you. So you can, anyway. Well, thanks very much for listening.
Was